Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So Tim, you've been watching the ballot initiatives for the November election. So what should voters be looking at? What should voters be watching for?
Well, just recently, the Secretary of State certified all the measures that are going to be on the November ballot statewide, and we have ballot numbers. So I've been looking through to see, and, we're going to be voting on, it's not a heck of a lot of ballot measures, but, we'll be voting on everything from abortion to flavored tobacco products. But there's a few issues that we have been following at PRI and on our Right by the Bay blog that we'll be voting on again. The most expensive one, you're already seeing ads for it. They estimate when all is said and done, more than $300 million is going to be spent on this campaign. And that's the fight over sports wagering. And it's a battle in Propositions 26 and 27 between tribal gaming interests and, to a lesser degree, racetrack, and the online sports wagering companies like FanDuel and DraftKings. So Prop 26 would legalize sports wagering at tribal casinos and racetrack. Prop 27 would legalize online and mobile sports wagering. It's a huge issue. Billions of dollars potentially in tax revenue is at stake. If you ever watch sports, every sporting event you see, all of these FanDuel, DraftKings, it's become heavily part of watching sports. They already were spending money on ads for these measures before the primary election. You can imagine how much we're going to be deluged with ads on this before all is said and done. Another one, Prop 30, it's a tax increase for more green subsidies. It would be a 1.75% additional tax on income above $2 million. And the proceeds of the tax would go for electric car subsidies, to fund building new electric car charging stations, and wildfire prevention. And this would be a $3 to $4.5 billion annual tax. And as we know, it's another one of those kind of picking winners and losers, playing car salesmen to subsidize electric cars. And as Wayne Weingarten has found in his great study, Costly Subsidies for the Rich, these subsidies are heavily claimed by people making over $100,000 a year. And with all the costs and inflation and the expensive costs for electric cars, I can't see that a lot of working class Californians are going to be switching over to an electric vehicle, even with all of these taxpayer funded subsidies. Then the last one, Prop 29, is one of Rowena's favorites. It's on kidney dialysis clinics. And last year, and if you think we've voted on that, we've voted on it twice. It's been voted down twice, but we're back for the third time. And it's basically a fight between the SEIU, which wants to unionize dialysis clinics, and they haven't proven successful. So they keep putting on this measure, I guess, to kind of punish financially the dialysis clinic owners across the state. And Roe proved clairvoyant when she was writing about Prop 23, when she said, we'll likely be writing about dialysis clinics again in 2022. Roe, get ready. You get your chance now.
I know. And hopefully maybe this time, well, I can't say that, but hopefully this will be the last time. We don't know. But Bill, so Tim, I've been following this bill, Senate Bill 1162, which is working its way through the legislature. And you got to listen to this. It would require the state to publish the pay data of workers by race, ethnicity, and gender for companies with 100 or more employees. On top of that, businesses with 15 or more employees have to include the pay range for advertised positions. And on top of that, the bill would also give employees the right to know the pay scale for their current position. So a little bit of background on this. Back in 2020, California passed the nation's first state-level pay data reporting law, and that required employers to provide the number of employees by race, ethnicity, and gender in 10 job categories based on the EOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, based on their categories, and within the pay bands used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the data, which was always intended to be confidential and just reported to the state, well, SB 1162, if it passes, makes all that data public. So even at the time, the EEOC said that these reports are not useful in showing any kind of pay disparity in the same job category. So for example, the category of professionals, everyone from a person fresh out of college to a senior person, in his career would fit that category. And obviously that would mean tens of thousands of dollars of pay differential. So this data is actually meaningless. The Cal Chamber calls it a job killer. And you can imagine how the plaintiffs' attorneys are just going to go to town on this bill. Actually, that's because any employee, even one who isn't interested in a job opening and hasn't even been harmed by any kind of so-called pay disparity, could bring a claim based on this law. And obviously the woke activists who want to shame companies will also be all over this. A few years ago, Jerry Brown actually vetoed this bill for precisely this reason, but now it's back. It was introduced by Santa Barbara Senator Monique Limon. Her purpose was to try to close the pay gap among minorities and women. And that's a laudable goal. But, there are already excellent websites that publish pay information for thousands of job categories, depending on location, your level of experience, education, blah, blah, blah. We've all looked at them. They're very useful and they're great for negotiating salary. This EEOC data won't help. And again, it's only helpful for the plaintiffs' attorneys. So I'm following that. What are the chances of having a bill like that pass?
Well, it seems like a very virtue signaling bill. The quotas for corporate boards bill that passed the legislature easily and was signed into law. So I feel like in this legislature, in this environment, unless some major well-heeled interest is offended that would break up the Democratic coalition, I feel like it probably has a good chance of passing.
Wow. I always like to ask you this question. I said, Tim, this is kind of crazy. And you say, yeah, Rowena, it's going to pass. So anyway, well, before we go on to our guest, I wanted to put in a plug for a luncheon we're having in Newport Beach at the Pacific Club with Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald. And she will be discussing with our very own PRI fellow Steve Smith, the rising crime in California, as well as homelessness. And that's going to be on Tuesday, August 2nd. It's going to be a terrific discussion. The last time we had Heather McDonald as a speaker was pre-COVID back in 2019, I believe. And if anything, crime has gotten a lot worse in the state.
And she'll be talking with PRI's Steve Smith, who you may have read some of his great pieces on Right by the Bay. And, Steve has a great background in law enforcement. He was a criminal justice professor. So it'll be really interesting to hear the two of them mix it up on issues of crime and homelessness and other issues like that in California. So this week on Next Round, we have a very interesting and topical discussion with Eric Edwards and Sara Sutherland from PERC, and they have a great new report that they just released showing that federal bureaucracy is hindering efforts to initiate and complete wildfire prevention projects across the state. And for those of you who read our CEQA Gauntlet study earlier this year, this is something that we found that the California Environmental Quality Act is making it very bureaucratic and very difficult to get wildfire relief projects approved and completed. Well, it doesn't sound like things are that much better at the federal level when you hear their discussion. So I think, in this season, when sadly we seem to have way too many wildfires across the state, I think we all need to remember the role that government bureaucracy is playing in hindering planning efforts that we could be undertaking to reducing the risk of or severity of wildfires.
So thanks everyone for listening. And here's Eric and Sara. Sara and Eric, welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Hi.
We're happy to have you on to discuss an issue that affects millions of Californians, reducing wildfire risk. You've both written a terrific new analysis for the Property Environment Research Center on how federal environmental review regulations are adding unnecessary time and expense to efforts to reduce wildfire risk. So let's start by setting the stage for our listeners. What are the two common wildfire mitigation measures, and how effective are they at reducing wildfire risk in the short and long term?
Great. This is a great question to start off with. So the two main tools that the Forest Service has to fight wildfire, mitigate wildfire, are mechanical treatments and prescribed burns. Now, the purpose of both of these treatments is to remove ladder fuels that essentially carry flames like a ladder up to the canopy of the forest where they're more destructive. Now, mechanical treatments utilize machinery to remove and rearrange vegetation in the forest to reduce these ladder fuels. And mechanical treatments are sometimes more heavily relied upon in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, and this is where when people live on the edge of forest, essentially, and those are relied upon in the WUI because they don't have the risks that are associated with the prescribed burns, so escapement or reduction in air quality. Now, prescribed burns, they also burn lower level ladder fuels, such as dead trees, low branches, and shrubs, and they can keep the fire from reaching the crown of the forest. And these can be either ignited by managers, or they can be naturally occurring and allowed to go on in a managed way by forest managers. Now, for both of these treatments, they occur about anywhere from like 3 to 15 years, depending if you're talking about a prairie or a dense forest. But none of them are, it's something that you have to keep doing and for maintenance. Now, prescribed burns, they're cheaper most certainly than the mechanical treatments, but they do have their limitations, like I said, with reductions in air quality, and they require a pretty specific set of weather conditions to ignite these prescribed burns, because obviously you don't want to light a prescribed burn on a hot, windy day. Now, these treatments are very effective, and I think they're most effective when they're used in combination or trading off with one another. Some studies that have been done have shown that they effectively can erase the crown of the forest and disrupt the growth of a surface fire and limit its intensity and canopy scorch from anywhere from 100 to 40%, which is pretty significant. They reduce the scorch height and they limit the flame length. Now, what has become a rather famous aerial photo from the bootleg fire that occurred in Oregon last summer. It was one of the biggest of 2021. Photo was published in the New York Times. And you have this picture of essentially a road that separates a managed and an unmanaged forest. So the fire moved through this area of the forest, but there's a stark difference between these two sides, between the managed and the unmanaged side. The unmanaged side, it looks pretty much decimated. There's not much of the forest left. And the managed area looks relatively intact. And so it's said there are these anecdotes from the forest managers and the people who were looking after this land, that they thought they saw the fire move in, and the flame height went from about 200 feet to about 4 feet when it moved into the managed forest. And so the fire did keep burning, but when it hit managed forest, it burned with lower intensity and it became more manageable.
So you write about how the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, holds up these critical wildfire risk mitigation projects through bureaucracy and in some cases litigation. So explain to our listeners how NEPA gets in the way of wildfire management, and what are some of these bureaucratic requirements that are holding back critical projects?
Great. So to answer this question, I think we need to get into a little background about NEPA, because when you're studying bureaucracy, the devil really is in the details. So many listeners are probably aware of what the National Environmental Policy Act is. It was signed in 1970, and it requires all federal actions that affect the quality of the environment. So really any action the federal government takes or any agency takes to provide a detailed statement on the environmental impact, potential alternatives, and then some other reporting requirements. But importantly, there's no requirement in NEPA that any agency needs to take any particular action as a result of this information. It's merely a requirement to provide the information. And so generally each agency, although there are some consistencies, they handle NEPA reviews on their own terms. And so at the Forest Service, which manages the bulk of the forest land and the land that's potentially burned in wildfires every year, each on-the-ground activity that they undertake generally must be justified under some approved NEPA project. So that means that the agency's process for NEPAs is going to determine all their actions in the forest. And this process differs depending on the significant impact that a potential activity takes, right? So all Forest Service projects will start with the NEPA approval project or process, but there are different levels of analysis. A categorical exclusion is used when projects don't have a significant environmental impact. When they do, there's a requirement to write a big environmental impact statement. And then there's environmental assessment, which occurs somewhere in between. Categorical exclusions are the least intensive. EISs are very intensive. These impact statements can be hundreds of pages long. They're documents with a full discussion of significant impacts, potential alternatives to avoid or mitigate damages. And all of this entails significant research, the use of many experts within the Forest Service to provide their expertise. For instance, the bear biologists or someone who's can provide the analysis of watershed impacts. The process also requires formal public comments, responses to the comments, several drafts available for comment, and so on. So to get to the answer to your question, the process itself is very time consuming, right? And the Forest Service must perform all these analyses, comment periods, et cetera. And so that's what potentially delays the projects and what we document in our report. When projects aren't undertaken, of course, the cost can arise, and that's sort of the backbone of the report.
So now California has its own version of NEPA. It's called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And PRI has documented it in its study, the CEQA Gauntlet, that CEQA hinders not only housing projects, but also projects involving virtually every priority of Californians, including climate change mitigation and wildfire risk abatement. So from your research, how is CEQA making California's wildfire risk management even more difficult than the projects being stopped at the federal level and in other states by NEPA?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I think it's good to compare and contrast CEQA and NEPA a bit. CEQA is similar to NEPA in that it's primarily interested in requiring reporting on environmental impacts, and CEQA, of course, applies to state of California agencies, whereas NEPA is related to federal actions. And so, in the case of the Forest Service, NEPA review are directed at Forest Service activities only. And in contrast, CEQA applies to every decision in which a California state agency will issue some permit. So one of the key differences is that CEQA will apply to any project in California for which a state permit is required, which could potentially apply to a broad array of forest management decisions, right? Anytime a state agency would have to issue a permit to do something in the forest, that could involve CEQA. And generally, NEPA jurisdiction would just be over the Forest Service projects. And so NEPA, while NEPA would not ever directly stop a project at the federal level, it would just delay it. CEQA is a little different. Even in the case of litigation, which I'm sure we will discuss more because it's one of the key aspects of NEPA, the lawsuits generally occur after the NEPA approval process has occurred, and so they lengthen the approval time. And so with NEPA, it's more like death by a thousand cuts, as these delays and changes in on-the-ground activities mean that over time, some projects may not make sense anymore, may not ever be undertaken. In the case of CEQA, because it's associated with this actual permitting decision, you'll often hear that an agency will undertake the CEQA process, and then that state agency might use the results of that process to actually deny the permit. And so that actually makes it much more of a direct link. So while we don't have any data and our report is focused on the federal level, it's definitely probable that CEQA itself also leads to the denial or the change in permits at the state level.
So the cornerstone of your study is an analysis of how much time these requirements add to wildfire mitigation projects across the country. So share your findings with our listeners. Just how much time and expense is being added to critical projects thanks to these bureaucratic rules and regulations?
So the amount of time NEPA adds to wildfire mitigation projects really depends on the type of project, whether it's a controlled burn or mechanical treatment, and what category of analysis this project falls into. So Eric kind of just touched on this, but if the project is determined to have no significant impact, it receives the categorical exclusion, and it's excluded from more stringent review. This is supposed to be an expedited way through the NEPA process. If the impacts are uncertain, it goes to the second tier level of review, which is the environmental assessment. And third, the most stringent type of review is the EIS. So the amount of time the project spends in the NEPA process is increasing with the level of intensity of review. So the categorical exclusion is supposed to be the least time, while the EIS is going to be a lot longer. Now, on average, these management projects spend about 465 days in the NEPA process, but projects that end up requiring an EIS, or the most intense form of review, will spend nearly 3 years under review, about 1,000 days. Now, interestingly, projects that are categorically excluded because they've been predetermined to not have significant impacts on the human environment are still taking a little over 9 months to go through the NEPA review process, which is kind of a long time for something that's supposed to be, it's supposed to be expedited.
So we don't have an exact number for how expensive the process is. And we don't have an exact number for the cost for a number of reasons. But there are two costs that we should think about. The first is the cost of actually administering the process. That's the cost of paying for the analyses, running the public comment periods, paying for any contractors that need to be hired to perform analysis. And the second is something that we as economists would call the opportunity cost. And that's the cost of things that are lost because we're undertaking a long review process. And so this could be the lost money from the timber that could be harvested in these thinning operations. But most importantly, it's the cost of the increased risk for not treating the forest. The increased risk, meaning some untreated forests might burn in a more significant or catastrophic way and cause more costs. And so those are additional costs that we need to think of. And then within the Forest Service process, we have to think about how the process might be changed and might actually be being lengthened in order to deal with the NEPA process in general, and especially the litigation associated with it. And so if you talk to people at the Forest Service, they'll talk about this idea of a bulletproof NEPA analysis that's creating enough work, enough proof in your analysis that means that any litigation, you'll have covered all of the potential avenues, right? And so this increases the amount of time and, as we say, increases that opportunity cost.
So one of the most interesting aspects of your study is that you point out that dragging out when these projects can be completed also increases the wildfire risk in many areas. Based on your research, can you quantify how much potential destruction of valuable forest land and private property is actually attributed to the delays caused by these regulations?
Yeah, this is kind of the $1 million question here. And unfortunately, there's not a good way to quantify this, at least not in our report. And this is a key challenge with evaluating a policy like NEPA in general. NEPA provides benefits in terms of the information about environmental impacts of federal actions, but it's also costly to administer. And as I just mentioned, what's often excluded from this benefit cost analysis is the opportunity cost. And so what makes this difficult to understand is we don't observe what the Forest Service would have done absent these delays, right? So there's a variety of issues associated with estimating these costs. One of the key challenges in understanding NEPA, both at the Forest Service and within other agencies, is really a lack of clear data on the NEPA process, how long it takes, and what it does to actions within each agency. And the GAO has done reports on a variety of agencies trying to get at these NEPA costs. And often the agencies themselves don't have sufficient data to allow the GAO to actually estimate these costs. One of the things that we've done in this project is pull together several kind of disparate data sources within the Forest Service in order just to understand the length of time for these wildfire mitigation projects, the prescribed burns and fuels treatments, how long that takes. But that was a challenge in and of itself. Attributing different costs and things within the, sort of the bureaucracy of the Forest Service to these particular activities is very challenging.
So one way around the roadblocks from NEPA is litigation, of course. But as you write, NEPA decisions that are litigated also add significant delay and expense to wildfire mitigation efforts. So in your view, does litigation really provide much relief at all in the end?
Yeah, I don't think I would characterize litigation as a way to provide relief to NEPA or as a way around NEPA. First, litigation is undertaken and the Forest Service after the NEPA process is already complete. So the Forest Service does its analysis. If it requires significant analysis, it will perform the EIS, have the public comment periods, et cetera. And then if a particular group or individual didn't like the outcome, they could then file a lawsuit. And so in this system, the litigation can only add delay in getting projects undertaken. So if the Forest Service failed to evaluate a key environmental impact of its proposed prescribed burn or mechanical treatment in its EIS, the lawsuit could force them to reconsider the EIS or return to the analysis stage. And as we discussed, NEPA really has no bite in terms of whether an agency decides to undertake a project or not. So unfortunately, there's no way to file litigation to speed up the analysis or to change an agency decision under NEPA.
We show in our analysis that litigation adds up to 1.9 years for mechanical treatments and 2.6 years for prescribed burns to the total time from the project's initiation to when the first treatment began. We see litigation as a key way that these projects are delayed.
Now, earlier this year, the Biden administration announced a plan to treat an additional 50 million acres across the country to reduce wildfire risk. Do you think that the plan will ultimately be successful, or will this effort inevitably be mired in the same bureaucracy and litigation and delay?
So this is a very ambitious goal, and there are a lot of obstacles to treating an additional 50 million acres over the next 10 years. So in recent decades, to give this some perspective, in recent decades, the agency has been treating about 2 million acres annually. So if things continue status quo, we'll only hit about 20 million acres over the next decade. So if nothing changes, without additional funding, personnel, and a change to the way fuels management projects are categorized in the NEPA process, it would be really difficult to achieve this goal. Broadening the types of projects that are classified as categorical exclusions that tend to make their way through the NEPA process more quickly could provide some time saving.
And one of the things we want to emphasize coming out of our report is there are delays across the process and moving from initiating a project to actually implementing a forest treatment. One of those barriers, as we've been discussing, is how long it takes to go through the NEPA process. But we find that even after the NEPA is approved, there is still a long period before treatment, 2 to 2.5 years for mechanical treatments and 2.5 to 4.5 years for prescribed burns. So while we we understand more about Nepa and how we might be able to expedite Nepa via requiring less significant analysis or speeding up the analysis that is undertaken, we have less insight into what can be done to reduce this kind of second round of delay, whether it's related to funding, whether it's related to the availability of project personnel and things like that. So there are additional actions and additional information that's needed to really understand, beyond improving Nepa, how to go about treating additional acreage.
Building on that point, looking forward, what in your view can either Congress or the Biden administration do to reform the laws so wildfire prevention efforts that the vast majority of Americans would agree with aren't stuck in unnecessary bureaucracy? And are there any reform efforts underway in Congress that we should keep an eye on?
So this is a really challenging question because there have been reform efforts in the past, but we still remain in the same problem. And that problem is that NEPA analysis the time it takes to perform NEPA analysis has been increasing over time, not decreasing. And so what are some of the reform efforts that have been undertaken? Well, Congress has launched a number of initiatives since 2000. You may recall the Healthy Forest Initiative in 2002. In 2003, there was the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Generally, these acts and later ones in 2018 and 2020 tried to classify from Congress, right, that certain projects should be exempt from intensive NEPA review. And in particular, certain smaller, under 2,500 or under 3,000 acres projects should be exempt from environmental impact assessments and should just receive the categorical exclusion. As we show in our analysis, this could change, NEPA times from something like around 1,000 days for requiring an environmental impact statement to around 280 days for a categorical exclusion. So that would cut a significant amount of time off of these, but they've generally not been super successful. And so one of the reasons is that the Forest Service has seemed reluctant to use categorical exclusions as a way to move forward on a lot of these projects, simply because the threat of litigation and the desire to create environmental impact assessments, environmental impact statements that stand up to future litigation. And you don't have as much opportunity to do that if you just skip over the whole process. And so the other part of the question is what could be done? That's what has been done. What could be done? I think there are some fundamental incentive problems within the Forest Service that need to be addressed. Although I think those, the people at the Forest Service, the agency itself, might be in the best position to say how to address those. But the fundamental problem is that the Forest Service is really not rewarded for implementing treatments in a timely manner and being aggressive at getting treatments done and preventing wildfires. But they are, in a sense, punished if some of their projects receive litigation or held up in litigation. So the incentive problem is really, how do you incentivize faster and smarter NEPA process and better NEPA process that doesn't require so many years of analysis?
So now finally, our favorite question. We call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy while enjoying a glass of wine. So what beer, wine, or adult beverage, or any other beverage actually, are you enjoying this summer to celebrate the publication of your new brief?
So we're in Bozeman this summer working at PERC, and although we don't have a lot of vineyards or wineries here, there are a lot of good breweries. So I've made my way through Bozeman breweries, trying all the hazy IPAs that we have to offer here.
And I'm not sure how well distributed some of these Bozeman beers are to your listeners, but one of my favorite Montana breweries is the Big Sky, and I think Moose Drool is distributed kind of throughout the country. So I encourage your listeners, if they want to taste some Montana beers, to check out the Big Sky Brewery.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's great.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.